Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith, Photog J the Great. Quite some time ago we took a look at the Nikon 70-200 f4 and that lens is around $1,400–1,500 USD, and I mentioned that for the same price it was possible to get a 70-200 2.8 if you went with one of the aftermarket companies like Sigma or Tamron. But I got to thinking, I wonder how the latest Sigma and Tamron offerings compare to the Nikon. So that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be comparing the Nikon 70-200 VRII to the Sigma 70-200 OS and the latest Tamron 70-200 2.8 VC. All three of these lenses have stabilization. In Nikon, they also have a lens called the 80-200 2.8, which is an older lens, that doesn't have AFS focusing, and it doesn't have stabilization or anything like that. I used to own that lens also, so I can kind of comment on it just in case you're curious. Basically, if you're looking for a 70-200 2.8 around that price range, I'd say that you've got $1,100 USD for something like that, or you've got about $1,200 USD for the Sigma, about $1,500 USD for the Tamron, although currently there is a $100 mail-in rebate on that one, and you're looking at about $2,400 USD for the Nikon. In comparison to an older lens like that 80-200, you would definitely be better off with going with either the Sigma or the Tamron for a similar cost. However, back on track as far as this comparison goes, obviously I'm going to show you some samples and back up all the statements I'm about to make. But if you're curious right now which lens wins, I'm going to just go ahead and tell you right now. I was pretty much dead. Pretty much exactly what I thought was going to happened here. I did have a couple surprises along the way that I'll tell you about a little bit later. But basically, it pretty much comes down to the Tamron and the Nikon. Definitely the older age of the Sigma shows. Obviously this is Tamron's latest offering, so it's extremely comparable to the Nikon. The Sigma was just completely in a different stratosphere. It wasn't even, it's not even in the running as far as I'm concerned. There is a noticeable difference between the Nikon and Tamron. They're kind of on the same plane, I'd say. And then you've got the Sigma, which is a step below the two of them. So I would essentially forget about the Sigma. Just forget it exists. I would definitely go for the Tamron or the Nikon. Both those lenses were noticeably sharper than the Sigma lens. And there's one other area too where I actually saw a great difference that I wasn't expecting, and we'll get to that later on. I'll go ahead and kind of give you an overview on all the lenses. And by the way, there will be more to this test later on. Unfortunately, the Tamron, it's the lens I've had the least amount of experience with so far. I do own the Nikon, so I know pretty much everything that it's capable of doing. I've spent a fair bit of time shooting with the Sigma in the past, but the Tamron, this was my first time really getting to shoot with it for any length of time. So this is kind of the one I want to spend more time with. Anyways, let's go ahead and take a closer look at all three of these lenses, and I'll kind of talk about each one individually, and I'll give you an idea of some of the differences that I saw between them. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with the Nikon. The one thing I'll point out is all three of these lenses come with pretty nice hoods. The Nikon and the Sigma both come with a nice case. The previous version Tamron actually came with a pretty decent case also. Interestingly enough though, this newer Tamron does not come with a case. So, if you've got a big rolling bag, toss all your lenses in there and that's no worry. But it is important to note, sometimes if I just want to take the lens by itself, or if I let someone borrow it, it's nice to have that little that nice soft case. But yeah, so I'll point out that the fact that the Tamron doesn't come with one. We'll start out looking at the Nikon lens first here. If any of you are familiar with the 70-200 VRII, you'll realize that the hood's a little bit smaller with this VRII than it is on the one. I think that a lot of that has to do with the closer focusing distance of this lens and the fact that the focal length changes a little bit at closer distance. I don't know, maybe Nikon felt that the longer hood would start to show up in the frame whenever the lens compresses at close focusing distances. We'll talk a little bit about that effect a bit later on. But anyways, I don't know if that's actually the case, but it sounds like a viable theory. Okay, we'll take off the hood here. And I do have a UV filter on this lens because, as I mentioned, this is my lens, and I get kind of clumsy sometimes. Okay, so brief rundown on the controls of the Nikon. Unlike the VR1 version of this lens, it doesn't have the little AF lock buttons that the previous version had, so that's kind of important to mention, I guess. Over here, though, you'll notice that we have Nikon's now very familiar setup, where we have not only the manual / autofocus, where you can do manual override and manual, but we also have the automatic / manual focus. So basically, as I've mentioned in other reviews with other lenses that have this, it takes a little bit more of a deliberate turn to get the lens to focus in the A-M mode. So you're basically not as likely to accidentally bump your focus off inadvertently. Down here, we have a focus limiter. This lens does have a pretty close minimum focus distance. So you can go down to 1.4 meters. However, if you're not taking something at a close distance, like if you're shooting, say, for example, a sports game, something like that, and you're focused on action that's quite a ways away, but you've got people moving between you and the action, and you don't want the lens to try to lock onto something closer, you can turn on the focus limiter. So instead of it focusing down to 1.4 meters, it will focus down to 5 meters. So there it's 5 meters to infinity. So that's what that does. Since, as you guys know, I'm primarily shooting portraits, weddings, things like that, I pretty much leave my lens on full probably 90% of the time. You got your VR on and off down here, pretty self-explanatory. This lens claims something like 4 stops of hand-holding capability. We'll get to that a little bit later on. And then we have normal and active modes. Normal is pretty much just for, you know, everyday handheld shooting. But if you are shooting from a moving vehicle, plane, helicopter, boat, whatever, then you put it on the active setting, and the lens looks for more erratic movements and supposedly cancels out those a little bit better. One thing that I've always liked about all the Nikon 70-200 lenses is the way that they've implemented their tripod collar. On a Nikon lens, this right here, whenever you loosen this little thing, this little knob here, this actually allows you to rotate the tripod collar like that. So if you're mounted on a monopod or something along those lines, and you want to shoot a vertical shot, you can easily rotate the lens while the collar is fixed. Of course, those dots there help you line it up, keep it straight. Now, unlike a lot of lenses, including the Sigma and Tamron 70-200, and even the Canon 70-200 FYI, this collar does not come off the lens. If you want to use this lens handheld, and the little foot is getting in your way, you actually just take the foot off. So you turn this right here, and it doesn't just immediately fall off. That wouldn't be good. So you have to press the little safety thingy there, and you can then slide this off and get rid of it. I had to actually dig mine out for this review because I shoot handheld most of the time and I practically never use that. So that's how that works. I've always liked that. You can hold the lens much better that way, and you don't have to take off your entire collar. You just take off that little foot, and it's something you can still keep in your camera bag. So that's something I like on that. As most like Nikon lenses, this one does have that little rear sill back there. A little bit of extra weather and dust resistance is not a bad thing, but of course none of these lenses are completely waterproof anyway. Okay, so that's pretty much the Nikon. Next up, we have the Sigma 70-200 2.8 OS. As I mentioned, it also comes with a nice hood, just like the Nikon and Tamron. One thing that's interesting about the hood on this lens is the fact that in the box, this lens comes with a little thingy to extend the hood. So by default, this hood is this depth, but there's a little adapter in the box that basically acts as a spacer between the hood and the lens, and it actually extends the hood out some. And basically it's designed for whenever you're using this lens on a crop sensor camera. Basically, since the lens has a greater effective focal length, you can have a little bit longer hood and it not show up in your picture, and you get the added benefit of a little bit more coverage. So that's what that does. Okay, we'll lose the hood for now though. And if we take a look at this lens, let's see here, take a look there, okay. We've got infinity there. And then we also have a closer focus distance that's very similar to the others, 1.4 meters there. This lens does turn in the opposite direction of the other two as well. Kind of interesting to note. So 200's that way, 70's this way. The other thing too that's kind of interesting to mention is, unlike the Nikon lens, the Sigma and the Tamron both have their zoom ring first up here at the top and their focus ring closer, whereas the Nikon is just the opposite. Looking at the lens here on the side, autofocus and manual focus right there. And Sigma, they have a deal that's a bit similar to Nikon's in terms of how the stabilization works. Of course, you've got off, you've got mode 1, which stabilizes in all directions, and then you've got mode 2, which basically only stabilizes on one axis. So if you're panning or something like that, say for example, you're following like a bird in flight or something, and you're panning across this direction right here, the lens is not going to stabilize in the direction you're panning. It's just going to stabilize in this direction here, because it figures that you're deliberately panning this way, and any movement this way figures that to be shake. So that's how that works. So it just stabilizes on one axis. Metal mount, obviously all three of these are going to be a metal mount lens. As I mentioned, no sill in the back of this one, and the Tamron doesn't have one either. Not that big of a deal really. As I said, none of these are really waterproof, but it is worth mentioning. Sorry if my bias shows a little bit here, guys, but as far as I'm concerned, well, at least in the case of 70-200 lenses, Canon, Tamron, and pretty much everyone else can't seem to make a intuitive collar. I definitely like the design of the Nikon better. So yeah, this one is exactly like the Tamron. You have to take this off, and then you pull up right here, and you have to remove the entire collar. So you have this thing to do something with after that, as opposed to just removing the foot like on the Nikon. Okay, so that's basically how that works. Oh yeah, and I will mention, of course, All three of these lenses are 77mm filter size, which is handy because most pro lenses in this range are at this point. So very, very nice there. Okay, we'll go ahead and look at the Tamron now. The first thing I noticed about the Tamron whenever I took it out of the package, aside from the fact that there wasn't a soft case to keep it in, is the fact that the hood on this is massive. It reminds me of the older Nikon 70-200 VRII hood. It's a very, very large hood. A lot of people actually complained about the newer 70-200 Nikon. They complained about its smaller hood size. Honestly, I really don't care, but you know, it's worth mentioning. Okay, so taking a closer look at the Tamron. Oh yeah, and one thing else I'll mention, and this applies to the Sigma as well. Notice that neither the Sigma nor the Tamron have a focus limiter switch like the Nikon does. So just something kind of noteworthy. If you end up using that a lot for your type of shooting, it might be beneficial. I actually hadn't noticed that until I did this test, because I actually never put my Nikon's limiter on. Okay, right here we've got the VC, which of course is what Tamron calls their stabilization. And then we have autofocus and manual focus right up here. From what I know about Tamron's stabilization system is supposedly a bit better at automatically detecting what you're trying to do. So that's why their stabilization doesn't have two modes like the Nikon. It's also kind of interesting that the the Nikon and the Sigma stabilization systems are only capable of stabilizing either in a vertical or horizontal axis, and that's it. If you're moving diagonally like this, or any variation, the Nikon and Sigma can't stabilize in those directions. The interesting thing about the Tamron VR is that, or VC as they call it rather, is that it can stabilize in diagonal directions. So if you are moving along these lines, because whenever you're shaking, you're usually not going to just be shaking like this or just be shaking like this. You're usually probably going to be going like this and like this. Anyways, so the Tamron is capable of stabilizing in those directions. So that's something that's kind of important to note. And I already talked about the Sigma's tripod color. The Tamron one works pretty much the exact same way. It just has a really, really long screw that comes off. And then, once again, just like on the Sigma, you're left with this big thing. Same thing. Yeah. Get rid of the hood for now. And of course, it is also a 77mm filter size. Let's see, close focus distance on this one. We can go down to 1.3 meters. So all these lenses are pretty similar as far as their focus distance is concerned. The biggest shock for me with this Tamron, and this is a good shock, the focusing on this lens is much, much better than the older Tamron lenses. So that's something that's very nice. Once again, metal mount. Oh yeah, I forgot. This is one of those Tamrons that actually does have a back little sill there. Once again, not that big of a deal, but it is important to know that it is there. Okay, well, I guess we will go ahead and take a look at some samples